Thank you all so much for attending the fourth panel as part of our Dissemination and Implementation Science Speaker Series. I want to briefly introduce myself, the broader goal of the speaker series, and introduce our esteemed panelists. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brianna Last, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Stony Brook University in the clinical area. And I organized this speaker series with the help of Dr. Joanne Davila at Stony Brook University, as well as the fantastic members of my lab, the Mental Health Care for All lab. The Dissemination and Implementation Science Training Series is part of a project that's funded and supported by the Academy of Psychological Clinical Science. The overall goal of the project is to strengthen dissemination and implementation science training across clinical science training programs. As population mental health challenges have become more pressing across the country and around the world, there is a real need to ensure that people can easily access high-quality, evidence-based mental health services. The question of how to meet that need is one that dissemination and implementation scientists have tried to answer. Since its inception, the field of dissemination and implementation science has developed unique methods, theoretical frameworks, and models that can help move the needle on population mental health and ensure that people get the support they need. But training in dissemination and implementation science is not widely available in clinical psychology science programs. So the purpose of our project is to leverage the immense capacities and expertise, as well as resources of existing programs to spread that knowledge to trainees. By making this speaker series free and virtual, we hope that it can support everyone who's interested in dissemination and implementation science. So today's panel, Implementing Contextually Sensitive and Culturally Humble Care, features esteemed panelists Dr. Anna Lau, Anna Baumann, and Maggi Price. Each are leaders in the field of dissemination and implementation science who have studied the needs of diverse and historically marginalized populations, as well as how our field can better serve them. I'm so delighted for these esteemed panelists to be sharing their work today. So I'm going to briefly introduce each panelist. So our first speaker is Dr. Anna Lau, and she's a professor of psychology and Asian American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, as well as associate dean for inclusive excellence in the life sciences. She's a faculty member in the Clinical Psych PhD program and directs the Culture and Race Ethnicity Care and Youth Mental Health Lab. Dr. Lau's work spans services research, translational and prevention research, and implementation science, focused on the needs of minoritized youth and the systems serving them. Dr. Lau seeks to leverage and adapt evidence-based innovations to reduce disparities in youth mental health in community settings, including schools. Next, we have Dr. Anna Baumann, who is Associate Professor of Surgery in the School of Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Baumann's research agenda focuses on identifying strategies to facilitate the implementation and dissemination of evidence-based interventions, policies, guidelines, and practices in low-resource settings nationally and globally. Her research is at the intersection of dissemination and implementation science, adaptation science, and healthcare equity. Dr. Baumann also serves as co-director of the Dissemination and Implementation Research Core, a methods core at the Institute of Clinical and Translational Sciences that provides methodological expertise to advance translational research to inform and move efficacious health practices from clinical knowledge to routine care. Finally, we have Dr. Maggi Price, who's an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Boston College, where she runs the Affirm lab. Dr. Price is an applied health equities researcher who studies stigma and youth mental health. Dr. Price has two active complementary domains of research focused on reducing mental health inequities for stigmatized youth, exploring how stigma across multiple levels creates and sustains youth mental health inequities, and developing and testing multi-level interventions that reduce stigma. The second domain of work currently focuses on improving multi-level supports for transgender youth. So in terms of the structure and logistics of the panel, each panelist is going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period at the end. I'll begin the Q&A period with some of my own questions before opening it up to the audience. So please hold your questions until the Q&A period at the end. Should you experience any tech difficulties or have any questions during the panel, please write to Laura Jans and Madeline Poupard. Laura and Madeline, if you want to wave your hands just so everyone can see who they are, to answer any questions you may have if you sort of lose the Zoom link or have difficulties. Also, in terms of accessibility, if you'd like to view the presentation with closed captions, you can click Show Captions on the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. Finally, Laura and Madeline will also be monitoring our email, dissemination.implementation@gmail.com, in case you get logged off for any reason. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to pass the torch on to Anna Lau.
Thank you so much, Dr. Last, for putting this speaker series together and for inviting me to participate with my really esteemed colleagues. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to share my slides. Can you see that okay, Dr. Last? Great, thank you. Today I'm going to be talking about some research that we've done that's was a collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Lauren Brook-Frizzi, where we really looked at adapting evidence-based interventions for youth and families, but through the lens of how it is that community therapists on the ground are doing this work, and how that relates to what investigators and researchers have done to approach this problem of enhancing the fit of our evidence-based interventions for diverse communities. So the title of this talk is Community Therapists Implementing Evidence-Based Interventions for Children, Observing Runtime Adaptations for Diverse Families. Okay, so there's been a longstanding and hopefully sort of in the past debate about the need for culturally adapting evidence-based interventions that are innovations from research settings as they are used and implemented in community settings. And some of the warnings or cautions about doing that work is that some folks point out that we have limited evidence of disparities in effectiveness outcomes for minoritized populations, and that we really shouldn't sort of tinker around with or jeopardize the fidelity of evidence-based interventions by adapting them. At the same time, we know that the evidence base is very limited in its ability to show generalizability in community settings. Some people worry that inefficient, just a lot of resources invested into sort of one-by-one adaptation interventions of specific EBIs for specific populations is an inefficient approach and results in sort of unnecessary proliferation of variants of intervention models. So we really should perhaps be focusing on where there are strong indications for the need for adaptation and a reasonable risk of generalization failure. So maybe we don't have a lot of evidence because of the limited evidence base that we have about differential effectiveness. We don't have a lot of research designed to do that well. There is a lot of evidence of reduced engagement, both in community care in general, as well as in evidence-based interventions, greater attrition and more difficulty even in recruiting diverse samples into trials. And we also have indications from our translational science literature showing that there is diversity in the range of risk and protective factors that precede the onset of and maintain child psych pathology, and that might also be an indication for the need to adapt interventions to address those differential patterns of risk. So in my own early work in this area, one way that I thought about how to approach this problem when we were studying the adaptation of parent training for immigrant Chinese American families, really thought about what might be the indications, what are the lived experiences of immigrant Chinese families that may be relevant to their needs for adaptation in parent training. So thought a lot about the beliefs and values surrounding child rearing and family process that might be relevant to consider in things like its acceptability of parent training interventions, talking about their learning history in terms of the skills and practices that they already are facile with in parenting their children and how that may or may not relate to the strategies that are to be taught. And then talking about risk and resilience, risk and protective factors for what we would consider maladaptive parenting, over reliance on corporal punishment, for example, and other uh, risk processes in immigrant families. So conducted some amount of translational research to really inform um, those experiences and how they may relate to barriers in the implementation and receipt of parent training, thinking about these potential candidate mechanisms of non-response to standard parent training approaches around treatment acceptability, the pace of skill acquisition when target skills are very unfamiliar to families, and unaddressed mechanisms that maintain ineffective discipline and child behavior problems. And we conducted a mixed method trial to really explore these avenues of adapting around enhancing engagement to promote treatment acceptability. Um, Questions around dosing came up a lot in terms of the pace of skill acquisition, and we added supplemental content to address what we thought were unaddressed mechanisms maintaining ineffective discipline. So that was an example of uh, how interventionists have approached adaptation. Researcher-driven adaptations can be thought of as design time adaptations of evidence-based practices, where they're designed a priori, and then researchers have tested these adaptations and shown them to be effective in controlled trials. And in a few instances, they've been shown to be incrementally more effective than their unadapted uh, uh, intervention counterparts. However, folks such as Dr. Baumann here today have also described how these researcher-driven design time adaptations of evidence-based practices are subject to the same implementation cliff and research to practice challenges as any other evidence-based intervention. So we actually have a really nice evidence base of adapted interventions that also goes nowhere, just like evidence-based interventions in general. In implementation science, we are, really comfortable with this idea that adaptation is both necessary and inevitable as evidence-based interventions move into community settings. And these are adaptations that are both contextually driven in terms of the needs of patient populations, but also the needs of systems and providers. That require changes to implementation strategies and may also have implications for the intervention delivery as well. And so we've been studying provider-driven runtime adaptations of evidence-based interventions. So when EBPs are implemented in community mental health settings, how do systems and community therapists adapt them? And we were interested in asking a question: how do these spontaneous adaptations align with the principles that researchers have adopted in their work adapting EBPs? And we're interested in implications for implementation outcomes such as adherence or fidelity to core EBP components. And David Chambers has really talked about this for a long time, that EBP adaptation in community implementation is really a natural and inevitable process. And you can see here, whoops, sorry, a number of sources of or indications for the need for adapting the intervention. So needs of the service setting, of the target audience or patient population, the need potentially for cultural adaptations that emerge when we transport interventions to settings that look very different than the research settings they were tested in. Um, So David talks about looking at these sort of naturalistic process of adaptation in community settings and really capitalizing on this to promote innovation and to sort of characterize what he describes as an adaptome and learning from the adaptations that promote positive outcomes implementation wise and effectiveness wise in this naturalistic process in the wild. I mean, he talks about adaptations that have a positive impact either on the reach of the intervention, its feasibility or acceptability, and those examples of adaptations being sort of positive deviance that can move the needle in a positive way for population health versus adaptations that may be more diminishing the impact of evidence-based practices or characteristic of drift. And I think a really nice concept in this space also is von Thiel-Schwartz and colleagues talked about the value equation, reconciling the considerations in this fidelity adaptation, potentially tension or debate. And here they ask, what is the value of the evidence-based practice that is produced for patients, for providers, organizations, and systems? And they state that an adaptation that decreases fidelity might still result in more uptake by community providers, more engagement among patients, and ultimately may produce a greater value for population health. So these are all things that sort of need to be considered together it's not probably a very simple question of an adaptation that may, have some potential negative impact on integrity, if the net impact is still better, if it becomes more feasibly carried out and can reach more folks. So we started asking some of these questions within the For Keep study, which was an observational study that it was investigating drivers of the sustained use of multiple evidence-based practices that were being rolled out in a system-driven implementation in the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. And we carried out a number of analyses asking how do therapists adapt EBPs in this context. So Los Angeles County, we're thinking about a lot of areas affected by the wildfires right now, but this is a very diverse service system. It's the largest county mental health system in the country. You can see the demographics here. It is a majority minoritized service population with only 13% non-Hispanic white. A number of practices were selected for county implementation support in a very rapid scale out of interventions for youth. And I'll just talk about selected findings from a number of papers where we were learning about how community therapists adapt EBPs for youth. In the first study, this was really survey methods, very much informed by the work of Shannon Wiltsey-Sturman at the time, who was developing her frame model of characterizing adaptations. So for those of you who are really interested in frameworks and typologies for adaptation of evidence-based practice, I definitely recommend reading Shannon's work on the frame and in collaboration with Dr. Baumann here, also the Frame IS, which is an adaptation framework for characterizing implementation strategies as well as adaptations. So in general, we were looking at adaptations that fell into these categories of, trying to enhance engagement, supplement intervention content, or perhaps intensify or modify dosing. And consistent with the frame model, we were looking at augmenting adaptations that modified the presentation of evidence-based intervention strategies, integrated supplemental content, or modified the pacing of interventions through lengthening or extending the pacing. Whereas reducing adaptations were those that involved omitting components of the EBP, shortening or condensing pacing, or adjusting the order of components. And this was, again, self-report methods. So this was therapists reporting on how they adapted the evidence-based practices they were trained to deliver. And as I mentioned, there were multiple practices being where the implementation was supported in the county. There were 5 practices. So what you see here are just self-reported means of the extent to which folks were reporting these types of adaptations across 5 different practices. And overall, you can see that therapists were much more often reporting augmenting adaptations that sort of added something to the intervention versus more subtractive or reducing adaptations. Um, you can see there just overall means reported on this scale. We also looked at predictors of therapist-reported adaptations. And here again, you could see a little more clearly the overall augmenting composite versus the reducing composite. Um, our Latinx community therapists reported more augmenting adaptations that sort of modified the presentation of, or added supplemental content to, or extended the pacing of interventions. And actually, therapists that were earlier in their training also reported more augmenting adaptations. Um, Whereas community therapists who had more negative perceptions of the fit of the intervention reported more reducing types of adaptations that in the prior Wiltsey-Sturman framework would have been called fidelity inconsistent adaptations. And there was one intervention that folks were more likely to report reducing adaptations. And that was an intervention that started out also having less structure. So it was more of a toolbox approach, and you could sort of pick and choose indicated modules. And folks reported that they were just kind of doing that more. So we think that the survey maybe didn't map onto that intervention very well. The next study we conducted was a mixed method study where we interviewed therapists about their reasons for adapting interventions. And again, augmenting interventions were the most commonly reported. And this pie chart just shows sort of the reasons, what the primary reasons why therapists were motivated to adapt. And for many of them, they were focused on developmental appropriateness, making interventions more accessible for younger children, variations in the presenting problem or symptomatology in family or caregiver functioning. Actually, a relative minority of folks were describing specific cultural adaptations. A lot of them were parameters of human or family diversity that also related to the need for adaptation around understanding or literacy and the like. Okay. So some of the interviews that we heard about the indications for adaptation around culture and developmental level really had to do with around culture, mostly around modifying the presentation, so aligning the intervention strategies with the preferences, values, and needs of culturally diverse families. So an example here, some of the original treatment may not fit well for our clients. We're trying to figure out how to translate the words that is more meaningful and easy to understand. And that was true around developmental level as well. So another quote around cognitive processing with younger children. And then another quote about cultural issues that really had to do more with pacing of the intervention rather than removing concepts or adding new strategies. And here's one that has to do with cultural values. These were actually all quotes from an agency that served Asian American and Pacific Islander families. So here's one. There's a lot of traditional Chinese values that we need to take into consideration. How do they want to process trauma? Do they feel comfortable with the process with us or more comfortable with their own support network? Do we need to change our approach? Okay, so that was a bit of a mixed method study. And then in this next study, we supplemented our sort of survey methods with just open-ended questions about how, at the session level, therapists described making adaptations in session. So, how are the distinct types of therapist adaptations? We also wanted to see how they were associated with EBP strategy delivery at the session level. So, we might consider this an implementation outcome that is akin to or in the neighborhood of treatment integrity. So here we had 103 therapists describe the adaptations they made in 680 sessions with 273 clients. We simply asked whether or not they had adapted the EBP for this client and then asked them how. We had a coding manual that included 13 codes, again, that was aligned loosely with the frame model. And we also coded the extensiveness of EBP strategy delivery with the ECHA. So I realize I'm running long, so I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here to say that, like our survey methods, we did find that most of the time when therapists were describing adaptations, they were describing these augmenting types of adaptations, modifying the way the intervention was presented, integrating content that wasn't represented in the EBI. A lot of that was psychoeducation. Sometimes they were combining with other types of services like case management or collateral types of interventions. Extending is extending the pacing of, slowing down the intervention, offering more sessions to repeat skills lessons, and lengthening modules and components. Less often, 20% of the adaptations had to do with reducing adaptations, so removing components, pausing the intervention, shortening the intervention. And then there was another category that emerged, which was generalizing adaptation. So using the EBI for a new problem focus or in a different setting. So you'll see more than half the time therapists were describing adaptations at the session level. And in terms of relationships to implementation outcomes, we found that modifying presentation adaptations were associated with more extensive EBP strategy delivery, whereas extending adaptations were actually associated with less extensive EBP strategy delivery in that same session. So we have some examples of what those different engagement strategies look like, which I'm going to skip through a bit, unfortunately. And then the extending themes, the extending adaptations tended to occur in the context of responding to some type of engagement challenge, and generally folks describing some challenge to learning. So a client taking a long time to engage in a trauma narrative, having to go over skills several times when the client seemed not engaged or not understanding. So we really felt like we uncovered some practice-based evidence through the wisdom of community therapists who were mostly doing augmenting and less often reducing adaptations. When attending to culture, they tended to modify the presentation and extend time spent on skills training. And those modifying presentation adaptations were linked to really nice looking delivery of EBP strategy, whereas extending adaptations, however, were not. And it may be that therapists need more support to respond when clients present with difficulties learning an EBP skills. And I will leave it there. Many thanks to my collaborators and community partners.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lau. That was really an incredible presentation. All right, I'll just pass it on over to Dr. Baumann.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Lance. Can you guys see the slides? Yeah, cool. Okay, so as always, I have a lot of slides. So I'm going to go fast. And this is a very different presentation than Dr. Law's in the sense that it's a more conceptual presentation and hopefully giving us some tools to think about what to do when we have context like what Dr. Laws mentioned. So it's a really cool segue, I hope, of her presentation. So my goal today is to give you one challenging, but one practical tool to think about how to embrace equity in your practice. And practice meaning your practice as implementation scientist, your practice as implementation researcher, practitioner, student, your life. If I can move the slides forward. Okay, so I have two learning objectives, one to define equity, and one to think about reflexivity as you select, adapt, implement your evidence-based interventions. So let's define equity. And why would we think about equity when we think about, say, culturally adapting evidence-based interventions? And what does that mean or could mean in your work? I do want a disclosure that I have not audited the slides for visual disabilities. So if you need audited slides, email me. If you do not know what that means, that's my hint for you to pay attention to how privileged we are in terms of visual abilities. When I talk about equity, it's important to me to share my positionality. I am a Latina, born and raised in Brazil, hence the accent, dual citizen, able-bodied, white-skinned colonizer. I am a single mom, cisgender scholar woman. And all those demographics affect the way that I see, perceive, and talk to you today. And as we talked about earlier, my work is in the context of implementation science, adaptation science, and healthcare equity. I do want to pause and recognize the challenge that we have in the world today around all things emotions. And so I just want to take a deep breath and explicitly recognize that today we can have all sorts of emotions as we embark in talking about equity and culturally sensitive practices. So what is equity for you? And what does equity practice mean for you as a person, as a researcher, as an implementation, as a practitioner? And those lists and those responses might be different, and that's okay. And it's important for us to think about those things because they permeate the way that you engage with the evidence-based practices. I will tell you what I think it's not equity. So let's define one thing by defining what is not. Equity is not an outcome. So when people come to me and say, I have diversity in my sample, that's not equity. It's not a checkbox. Equity is not a checklist. Oh, I have answered yes, yes, yes to several things. I'm doing an equity study. Equity is most importantly not the same as diversity. You might have diversity in a room or diversity in a sample. That does not mean that you're doing equity work necessarily. They're related, but they're not the same. Equity is not a deficit perspective, meaning if you work with one community, everybody else will fail. It's not a scarcity perspective. So then what is equity? Equity is different than inequality. Inequality is what we have right now. Consider all the context, place whatever evidence-based intervention, whatever outcome you want to do. Equality is when you do the same intervention or the same implementation strategies to different communities, regardless of where they are or what they need. Equity then, following up Dr. Law's presentation, is adapting either the intervention and or the strategy so you can meet the community where they are. Hopefully one day, the field of implementation science will talk about social justice. And I hope I can still talk about those terms today, considering context, where we dismantle the current oppression systems that are in place that affect the resources and the distribution of what we could have for quality of life. So, two definitions of equity. One is by Paula Braverman, who talks about health equity, meaning that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible, which means removing obstacles to health, such as all those things, poverty, discrimination, their consequences, and lack of access to quality of life, to what we all deserve, each one of us. What I want to highlight for you today is equity, meaning a process. Camara Jones really talks about equity as a process, which means a continuous reflection and action of both the historical and the contemporary injustices. And what does that mean? It means, again, that it's not an either or. It means that it's a constant evolution and reflection of the work that you do. And my slides are moving forward, so then here we are. I didn't do them. So the challenge that equity is really hard to define. This is a beautiful paper by Kelly Asherbrenner, who went and asked healthcare providers, healthcare leaders, patients, what is equity for you? And understandably, the lenses are very different. The definition of equity is very different depending on who you talk to. Hence the complexity of achieving equity, right? So it's a constant movement. It's complex because it has different perspectives. So what do we do? How do we do this? Why is it important to talk about equity in an explicit, open manner? It is important because if we don't talk about it, which is what probably people are trying really hard to do that, we permeate disparities in care. Let me be very explicit. If we don't talk about equity or equity markers, we will permeate the current disparities in care. So what might that look like in talking about equity? It might mean that we need to think about our guiding principles. These are some of them. Think about some of the guiding principles that are true for you. One of them might be the explicit recognition that racism exists. Period. Wait, hold on. It might mean that we need multi-sector partnerships. Hospitals are not the sole system of care, and how can we think about embracing different partnerships? It might mean that we need to tackle, as implementation scientists, with this thing called context. And what does that mean? And what is the effect of context, meaning economic, political, social determinants of health, and how they affect the selection and the implementation of EBIs. So with that passion, I ask you, as you do the work and as you select your implementation process and as you engage with your community, it's really important for us to think about what is the historical context of oppression that exists in that community, because there is. And how are you recognizing that history of oppression and challenge in the context of your work? It's not easy. It's really hard. So Dr. We were set several questions, and this is one of the questions that I was like, I can try to answer this. How can we maybe be humble and offer contextual relevant care? I don't know. This is really hard to answer, but here it is. Providing culturally appropriate care involves communication that's collaborative, and involves really thinking about what's the outcome. We know Dr. Law's work and several other people's work that when we are humble and we provide culturally care, it predicts positive clinical outcomes. But what does that mean? It might mean, and here's the tool, a positive relationship through reflexivity. The word reflexivity is not new. So here comes the objective 2. Understand the importance of reflexivity when selecting, adapting, implementing your evidence-based intervention. Reflexivity is a practice that comes from anthropology, from education, from social sciences, psychology. It's not new. It's a method. It's a tool. It's a fantastic thing. It hurts because it entails you thinking through what are your values and your mission as you engage with yourself, with the others in your team, with the community members, in your personal life, to really think about what is it that you're doing and what is it that you're not doing, who is missing, who is not missing, and what are the goals of your practices and your actions. So I love this paper, which was one of your reading papers, and the title says how to do decolonization research. So there you are, your second word, not prohibited today. But Dr. Sims and Dr. Nato talks about the different practices of reflexivity in different levels. So one is your own personal reflexivity, right? You saw me giving my positionality and how, for example, I will never be able to talk about the same thing if I were disabled, or if I had different color schemes, or if I were from a different country. My perspective, my demographic perspective, affects the way that I interact with the world and how the world interacts with me. And that's an important piece to recognize. The other piece to recognize is how that affects the way that I select my research team, my personal interactions, and how that then affects the way that I see my research questions, which goes next to your intervention implementation process. Every study will have a positive outcome and a negative outcome. Someone will be missing in your study because life is life and there's only so much money you can do in 5 years of work. So it's always important to think about what are the pros and cons and how is your work posing harm to potentially some people. And how is your research aligning with the community that you're working? Remember that we talked about the historical oppression of the work that you do. That also affects the theories that you're reading. Who are you reading? And who are you not reading? Who are you citing? And who are you not citing in your work? And that matters, because it also affects then how you select your methods of engagement. Who centers the voices as you select the intervention and the strategies? And finally, once you have your data, how do you communicate and how do you center the different voices and the different methods of communication, right? Art, poetry, music, all of those things are things that you can use to really center the community as part of your audience for your research sharing. So reflexivity are those pieces that help you think through the processes, because it affects the way that we engage with the community, so we don't have that drift of, hey, you're having all those beautiful interventions and then nothing happens. I will confess, I learned about reflexivity through anything that Erin Philly and Alison Hamilton write, right? Just sit down and read. So this is another way of thinking about reflexivity. This is a reflexivity around the study, right? So I just talked about reflexivity around your own processes and your own selection. Erin Philly brings reflexivity around thinking about how is the study happening? What are the main activities of the project and how are they going? And you can have different methods on how to achieve those reflexivity processes, right? Calls, memos, surveys, etc. As you implement your project, how are things changing? Are they changing? And how are you engaging with the community or not? And what does those changes affect the process of implementation? The assumption of reflexivity in the process of selecting and implementing interventions is that, as Alexander et al. Talk about, it has a larger public health consequence. And that is, as I learn about how I interact with the world, I'm learning about the outcome or potential positive and negative outcome of my study. And hence, I adjust and center it towards, hopefully, an equity perspective. So you have reflexivity and action, which is adjusting things in the midst of your project. Reflexivity on action, which is sitting down and thinking about the past. How could I do things differently? What is working? What is not working? And then really critically questioning your premise of the action. What are my values and how are my values affecting the way that I interact with my team? What do I do when people ask me, but Anna, this is wrong from my perspective. How do I interact with this? Because I will be wrong in many ways, right? And how does the team composition think through as you reflect in the process of selecting, measuring, implementing your strategies and your interventions? So this is my last slide. I told you I was going to be fast. I just want to open then and ground all of this into what Leo Cabas and I wrote in terms of centering equity in implementation process. So Leo and I talk about the 5 different perspectives, right? So thinking about reach from the very beginning, who is present, who is not present, where are you doing your implementation work? Designing and selecting intervention, really thinking through who are you doing this for and with and how. Implement what works. We have tons of strategies that can be centered in social justice and equity. We need to do more of that. Develop the science of adaptation, frame IS, Maddie, idea. They were all meant for you to use and adapt them. And centering equity at the forefront of implementation outcomes. Acceptability for you might be different than acceptability for somebody else. And how can we capture those different voices? And how are we centering the different voices? And what do we do when the voices are and perspectives are different? So the assumption here is that as you engage in your personal reflexivity, the team reflexivity, and the community reflexivity, hopefully you will center equity as we suggested, with the consequences of having public health and changes in healthcare setting. I'm trying to be positive today, people. And those are my slides and my comments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Baumann. That was great. And a nice kind of conceptual grounding. All right, I'll pass it on to Dr. Maggi Price.
Thank you, Dr. Last. And thank you, everyone, for being here, and to my co-panelists. I'm really honored to be here. So today I'm going to be really honing in on a large project that I did over the last several years that I think is really a case example, bridging implementation science methods with human-centered design and community-engaged research methods. And I will be focusing just on the developmental phase of this project. It was funded primarily by an early career award from the NIMH. And the focus of the presentation will be on how the community and my research team work together to design a clinical intervention and implementation strategies to help clinicians help transgender clients better in psychotherapy. So let's start with the health equity problem that we sought to address. So transgender youth, they have worse mental health compared to cisgender youth. They have 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with depression or anxiety compared to cisgender youth, just as an example. And this is because they experience more trauma, more discrimination, more adversity. So naturally, they might benefit from mental health care to address those adversities. However, when they go into mental health care, they often experience more discrimination. And like Dr. Lau talked about, health disparity populations have higher rates of treatment dropout, lower engagement, et cetera. This is very true for transgender youth, especially. And so their mental health care needs or their mental health needs remain untreated. So we know the clinicians need to do better. And clinicians want to do better by and large. They just don't know what to do. They don't know what the thing is. And the thing is kind of this implementation science language that I'll be using throughout. They don't know what the thing is that they're supposed to be doing. And this thing hasn't really been clearly defined anywhere. So of course that limits implementation. So the solution that I have come to through this project has 2 different steps. The first step is to identify and package the thing. First and foremost, what are we asking clinicians to do? And that involved developing a clinical intervention. The second step was to figure out how do we help clinicians do the thing. Once we've identified what to do, how do we help clinicians do it? And that involved developing and testing implementation strategies. All right, so I mentioned this briefly in the very beginning, but just to go over quickly the methods, I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty, but what we used was human-centered design, community-engaged research methods, and some implementation science methods. So the the study, even though it just focused on the developmental part, it was part of a larger hybrid type 2 pilot trial. I won't be talking about the pilot piece per se, but I do want to shout out that a lot of these methods have been covered in this specific speaker series. So I won't talk much about them, but I do want to refer you to Aaron Lyon's presentation about human-centered design. He was a co-mentor on this project, and Jeff Curran's presentation on hybrid. And that's all on YouTube for the series. Okay, so who was involved in this project? So my research team, we coordinated the whole thing, and I run a research team called the Affirm Lab. I should say, importantly, I am a cisgender person who, while part of the queer community, has a lot of learning to do and has spent many years learning how to be a gender affirming clinician. Though I have, loved ones who are transgender, non-binary, I have no lived experience. So my research team, we are gender diverse as a team. And of course, we really need to work closely with the larger community. So we teamed with community stakeholders that represented kind of all sides of the implementation universe. Most importantly, transgender and non-binary youth who are the primary service recipients. Also parents. For you child and adolescent clinicians out there, you know that parents are often super involved in mental health therapy. And they can also, they can facilitate and also sometimes act as a barrier to therapy engagement. So we involve them as well. And then, of course, mental health providers, the folks we really wanted to support in terms of changing their behaviors. Those included providers with expertise in working with transgender youth, as well as providers without that expertise, which were really our target audience. So this whole group of us worked on this project. Let's go step by step. So the first was to identify and package the thing. In other words, develop a clinical intervention. So how do we do this? We started out with a scoping review of literature. So although the thing hasn't been neatly packaged until recently, certainly people have been publishing on it. There's great empirical work out there. There's also a lot of good clinical guidance and community engaged and guidance from service recipients. So we reviewed that literature. Then we turned it into a list with clear, layperson-friendly, and action-oriented language. Though some of the literature out there is amazing, it's often riddled with academic jargon or it's incredibly vague. And what we learned from our stakeholders was that that it was incredibly important to be accessible, right? And I think as implementation scientists, we're often very guilty of not being super accessible in our language. So that was a big learning curve for our team. Third, we did focus groups with stakeholders with iterative editing, which basically just means we ran a gajillion focus groups and shared literally on Google Docs this list with all those groups that I mentioned. And we met and they edited, they added, they deleted, they made the language more accessible, etc. And so the thing that resulted from all of that work was something called gender affirming psychotherapy. And unlike a lot of interventions that are super routinized, manualized, session 1 do this, session 2 do this, gender affirming psychotherapy is really just a list of augmentation. So again, harkening back to Dr. Lau's great presentation, we basically just compiled these augmentations into one list of skills, so things to do, and principles, things to know. And of course, this was based on both the empirical literature, clinical literature, and the community that we partnered with. So very concretely, there's 38 skills and 27 principles in gender affirming psychotherapy. And just examples of this as a skill would be simply to ask about gender during intake, right? So that small little tiny additional step that you take that doesn't take away from the CBT or the DBT that you're doing. It's just a small addition that doesn't add a ton of work. One of the kind of key principles that came up was that family support is a key protective factor. So working with transgender youth clients might involve a little more parent work than cisgender clients. If you want to learn more, and I'll put these URLs in the chat too at the very end, But if you want to learn more about gender affirming psychotherapy itself or the process of developing with it, please check out the paper. For the journal that published the paper, Psychiatric Services, I also recorded a podcast. So for those of you who like to learn through audio, I know I do. I've also provided that URL here. Oh, and the slides will be shared with you too, so you'll have access to these QR codes later on. Okay, so that was step one. Moving on to step two, and I'm differentiating it by having a different slide background color. I should also note, thank you, Dr. Baumann, for flagging that these slides are also not audited for visual accessibility. So that's important. I'll have my email at the very last slide, and I'm happy to provide an alternative slide deck. So step two was the implementation strategy development piece. Later testing, but we're not really going to talk about testing during today's short presentation. So how do we help clinicians do the thing? So we reconvened our folks, our community stakeholders. I would say mostly the same people from the intervention development phase, though we did add a handful of folks. This was like 3-ish years of work. So we lost some, we added some. And the framework that we used actually for both intervention development and implementation strategy development was Aaron Lyon's Discover, Design, Build, and Test framework. Aaron talks about this in his presentation for this series, so again, not going to go into it, but this is kind of how we applied it. So part one, the first thing we did was we identified implementation determinants, and that is, in implementation speak, barriers and facilitators. Our main outcome was gender affirming psychotherapy adoption. And we identified those through focus groups with our stakeholders. So I'm just going to give you a bird's eye view of our results here because they're complicated. There was a lot. So these determinants are overlaid on a figure that is based on Eva Woodward's health equity implementation framework, which I strongly suggest for anyone doing a determinant study or an implementation strategy study that seeks to address the health equity problem. So you don't have to read this figure. If you really want to, you can definitely read the paper, which I'll give you soon. But what's interesting, what are the takeaways for these determinants? And I'm going to focus just on really what's most interesting from a health equity standpoint, given the focus of today's presentation, and of course, the problem that we're seeking to solve in this study. Okay, so two simple takeaways here. The first is that anti-transgender bias at the provider level, so this is kind of like a leveled out framework, so you can see like provider leads to attitudes, anyway, was a key barrier. So an illustrative quote here, I had my own clinicians say, are you sure this is what you want to do? And others who questioned if this was just a phase, like trying on an outfit. This was commonly endorsed as a barrier to the adoption of gender affirming psychotherapy at every level. Patient, provider, and parents noted this as a major barrier. A key facilitator was experience with the patient population, so in this case, transgender youth. Perhaps no surprise there, but important nonetheless. Okay. What we're going to do is develop strategies, and we want to develop strategies that target those determinants. So to do that, we identified and developed rough drafts of implementation strategies with our stakeholders, and then we did that iterative editing process again with our target audience, which in this case was providers, where basically we asked them to engage with the implementation strategies on Zoom, and then we watched them and asked them to give us feedback. What do you like? What don't you like? What can we fix? Until they were ready for real world testing. Okay, so results. So these are the results. I know there's a lot of trainees right now in this presentation, implementation science. When I was doing implementation science training, what I learned is that implementation scientists love a super complicated figure. It's like our favorite thing. So for the next 5 minutes of this presentation, I'm just going to have you read this figure quietly, and then you can ask me questions in Q&A. This is part of your training. Of course, I'm just kidding. I'm going to give you a couple takeaways. and this figure is in the paper, for better or for worse. It's under review, so we'll see if it stays. But you can check it out more if you are interested. So built implementation strategies. What was suggested by our stakeholders? A whopping 17 discrete implementation strategies. This isn't shocking if you look at other similar studies, but it was a lot of feedback to take in. We didn't build them all, we built 12 of them. And each of them targeted one or more of those determinants that we identified in that last step. They span 6 of Waltz's implementation. To them, 8 to be specific, were housed in an online self-paced training. Now, sometimes a multi-component implementation strategy is called a multi-component implementation strategy or an implementation intervention. So you'll see that language just for training purposes. And this is like a big learning curve for me, just understanding what words meant what in implementation science. Okay, so this is kind of like the landing page for that implementation intervention, i.e. online training that we created with stakeholders. The ones that we didn't create are on this list. So new funding, learning collaborative, changing credentialing, things that we just didn't have the time, money, or capacity to do. Again, this was funded primarily by a K award. And for those of you who have received a K award, you know that you're not rolling in cash. Okay, so 3 more takeaways. Let me distill this insane figure for you. The first of the 3. Teaching implementers how to build implementation strategies can overcome resource constraints. So those ones that we didn't build, we tried to address inside of the training. For example, it was really important that all gender bathrooms be available to our clients or to clients in the various service settings that we were trying to improve. And so we taught providers in the training some super cheap, easy ways to modify bathrooms, like with simple signposts. Next takeaway, inter-setting level strategies may be necessary for health disparity efforts. This is nothing new, but I think it might be particularly important in the health disparity space, and Dr. Baumann's written about this as well. An example of this is modifying electronic health record systems. So in the pilot that I'm not telling you much about, we partnered with a multi-clinic agency. And when we were going through this with them, we realized that they didn't have an affirming electronic health record system, like as simple as just having a space where you put like affirm name and pronouns. So we had to modify their EHR in order for them to actually adopt the practices that we were asking them to adopt. Lastly, patient stories provide a imaginal experience with the patient population, which theoretically combats bias. So one way, if folks don't have experience with the patient population, you can do rehearsal, you can do all sorts of things. Well, we found that was most scalable, because I should say that was one of our main goals, which is why we had this online self-paced training, was to have patients share their stories of both their life experiences broadly as well as their therapy experiences specifically. So I'm going to show you a video, just like a 30-second clip, so you can see what that looked like in the online training.
My boyfriend outed me as a trans guy during my sophomore year of high school, which pretty much ruined my life at school. I lost most of my friend group because they sided with him and thought I was crazy. Other people I didn't even know started sending me hate messages online and said I looked better as a girl, so I should give up on.
So this story, and many of the stories that are included in the training, they start off with like a life experience story, sometimes something that kind of resulted in the client pursuing therapy, and then going to therapy and having an affirming or not affirming experience with a therapist. So there was both, some opportunity to understand the lived experiences of the target patient population, as well as understanding what therapy looks like and what is helpful and what is unhelpful in therapy, which acted on a number of different mechanisms that are kind of beyond this presentation, but were important. And I think anecdotally from the stakeholder groups, I would say that having patient voice was probably the most important or what one of the most highly endorsed suggestions in terms of a training tool. I was going to say implementation strategy, but it's not actually part of the implementation strategy compilation, but it is a way that you can modify implementation strategies such as training to be more to address health disparities more explicitly. Okay, so if you want to read more about this, we also have like a very insane supplement. So if it's only in preprint and under review right now. So if you use that top QR code, it will take you to both the paper and the supplement. I do recommend the supplement if you're like writing a grant using similar methods, because we provide a ton of detail. And then if you want to do the training, it's actually available to the public now, and you can access it at that QR code below. For those of you who are students, we offer like a very deep student discount. Feel free to email me, or I think there's an email on that website that will point you to how to get that discount. Okay, so quickly, presentation takeaways. I found that human-centered design and combining that with community-engaged research method was a really great and efficient way for developing both a clinical intervention and identifying determinants and designing linked strategies. So I do recommend those methods and some of the frameworks that I mentioned. And then this is just kind of a summary of those takeaways that I had from the last half of that presentation. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Those were such amazing presentations. Virtual round of applause to our panelists. So before we open up the Q&A to the audience, I'm super eager for everyone's questions. I thought I would just ask one or two questions just to kick us off. And just for the audience to know, during the Q&A period, after I ask my questions, you can feel free to either write your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom, or you can use the raise hand function and ask the question live. But just so you know, we are recording the presentation. So if you don't want your face on video and on YouTube, then feel free to just put your question in the chat or Q&A function, and I'll ask it. Those were all amazing, and I saw lots of connections between all of your work. One thing that Dr. Lau mentioned, which I think I've been thinking a lot about, is how, our culturally adapted interventions, like other EBPs, are also experiencing implementation problems themselves. And so if we think about, if we take seriously the 17-year gap, right, from bench to bedside, if our culturally adapted interventions take that long, it seems like by the time those get implemented, they may not even be contextually sensitive and relevant. And so I guess I'm curious, how that may sort of shape the way we think about how to do this work. Maybe that means sort of guiding people with runtime ideas. Like, I'd just be curious how you all have been thinking about what to do in light of the sort of persistent implementation gaps that our field faces.
That's a great question, Brianna, and I love Anna and Leo's paper on this issue. I think it's a great read. But you're right. I mean, I think if we just think about, I think Academy folks are very familiar with this idea of the way we move the field forward is through these like highly structured multi-component interventions that are basically our model has been disseminating by manuals and then proprietary trainings, and they're highly specific, right, and routinized, and that's really, just something that we've done in the last 30 years. It's not really historically how healing practices have been like taught. So yeah, I think part of, and then the cultural adaptation research that also comes from that like efficacy lens is likewise like that's it's just highly specific and prescriptive, right, approach to how do you go about being responsive to community needs, Whereas I think something like what Maggie's producing, it's principle based. It's really sort of like, how do you know if you are attending, in what ways can you attend to the needs of a population, sort of regardless of, what the specific like intervention model or approach is, like third wave CBT. So I do think, part of our problem is just like how we think about, like, how do we teach people to do therapy? And we just have, we're sort of, I think, adapting to the situation where we have, like, we've painted ourselves into this like weird corner in the way that we've tried to move quality of care in communities through what is essentially a practice that has to do with randomized controlled trials and like measuring integrity and fidelity so that we can operationalize the independent variable in our randomized controlled trial. And I think there's a lot to unpack there in terms of like, in whose interest is it that we're doing, like informing how to do care in this way, and like who's profiting from this way of like sort of tightly controlling things in the field. But so I'm just going to sort of name that, but I don't necessarily know, I think that we have to think more broadly in training when we're, what, how are people being exposed to, like, what is an evidence-based intervention? And does that mean it's attached to a brand name manual, or are we going to, have a more principle and strategy-based way of teaching folks what effective care looks like?
Yeah, that's a very compelling response. I'm curious if Anna or Maggie, you want to add to that.
I just had a small note to add, which is, I mean, I think, yes, the way that we addressed this was through the kind of principle and skills, like augmentation over specific manualized treatment approach. And even that has its limitations, right? And so within GAP, for example, we have a skill that's like annually check up on the latest gender terminology. And we provide a bunch of resources that we know, like websites that we know are regularly updating their list based on best practices that are endorsed by the community. And even that has its limitations, right? Like we're constantly checking the URLs that aren't broken. And this is my like small research team, not necessarily something that's gonna live on forever. So yeah, that was it.
This is really hard, and I love listening to the responses. This is why I love panels. So Leo and I, when we were writing the paper that Anna was referring to, we had multiple conversations, right, about the social justice of culturally adapting the cultural adaptation field. So we're both trained by Melanie Dominic Rodriguez, Guillermo Bernal, and Allah in terms of like the frameworks, as Anna mentioned, right? It's like you have this intervention, now adapt it. And it stops there, right? I do want to recognize the historical perspective. Implementation science as a field, not as a process, is recent, right? We're in the teenage. We're like in the troubleshooting space now. So the 17-year gap is a problem. And, to your point, if we develop an intervention and an adapted intervention and adapted it again, we are increasing potentially that 17-year gap. Right. So I think this is the space, and you're all as a trainees, right? This is the space to question those practices. And this is the space to have practices like, now we have studies showing why we need to adapt, the importance of adapting, how to think about adaptation as a science, as a process, as a strategy, right? We have work by several of us saying there are principles, there are ways to do it. And then we have work by many others saying RCTs are not the only way to conceptualize what an evidence-based intervention might be, right? We have factorial designs, we have frameworks like MOST, we have user-centered designs. So now is a space to really think creatively about, as you develop your intervention and as you adapt interventions, to really think carefully about what is the method that you're doing and what are the outcomes and what are the pros and cons about those. So it's a really exciting space to me, right? To see that we have science now that allows us to play with the evidence-based development, building on all the knowledge, and that tension of 17 years is a lot of time.
Yeah, that's super informative. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives on that. I'm also curious about, each of your presentations is sort of focused on this idea that, there are people who need to learn sort of knowledge, and then there are going to be folks, providers, parents, some stakeholder group that may not be as receptive to these ideas, these adaptations, these ways of thinking. And so I guess I'm curious sort of how you think about your audience and sort of the way that you develop knowledge based on who that audience is. I know that's kind of like a big question, but sort of each of your talks kind of touched on those. I guess one thing I'm also thinking about is Dr. Price, your work. Right now I'm doing a systematic review with some folks on sort of change efforts in the field. And, it's still such a prevalent practice. So how do we, which providers are we changing and sort of teaching? And what does that look like for each kind of provider group?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm happy to touch on how I've done that for this specific study, or how I've attempted to, because we, as one tends to do in a study, we collected a lot of data, and because this was an implementation focused study, we collected a ton of acceptability data. And though we were working in a clinic that is primarily located, it's a multi-state agency, but most of the locations were urban centers in pretty liberal states. That said, we got a lot, kind of a surprising amount of pushback on some of what we were teaching. And so we did a little spin-off qualitative study where we reached out to those folks, those who expressed a special, a high level of skepticism, to interview them. And they were quite excited to talk, actually. And so that was really useful. I gained a lot of insight about how we could modify things. And that I haven't taken additional steps to do so yet, other than writing grants saying I want to do this. But part of that involved both modifying our implementation strategies. Actually, I would say more so modifying implementation strategies than the actual content. It was really about how we packaged the content that folks were turned off by. And I will say, these folks were more in the conservative space, which is very much encroaching on our science, obviously, right? But also we need to be accessible to those folks, because that's, or at least for the work that I do, that's really the hearts and minds that I want to change. So anyways, that provided some kind of good preliminary data for writing some proposals to do this in less hospitable places. In the process of writing those proposals, I reached out to folks in especially conservative areas, and though there are some great people who really want to create change in those regions, they often were met with pushback at the most senior levels. So there was a lot of partners where we got really close to having them be a partner in the grant proposal, and then they would pull out once the CEO got wind of it or whatever. So we ended up for kind of the next steps focusing a little bit more on the middle space. I'm trying to speak without referring to specific regions of the country. Sorry if it sounds a little vague. In any case, we kind of got a diverse range of partners for the next stage, so we could start understanding the perspective of providers and start modifying those implementation strategies for the providers in places that are less hospitable, because we also know that transgender youth in those regions need care far more than they do in the more hospitable places. So yeah, that's why that was a long winded way of hopefully sort of answering your question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to admit that I've lost track of the original question. But as Maggie was talking, um, and and sort of one of the, I think, goals of this particular uh, session in this speaker series is really about like contextually and culturally humble practices. And I think we just learned so much from, centering the voices of community providers who were in this context being asked very rapidly to scale out multiple evidence-based interventions. Um, and I think that, it was very, I think, instructive for us, because I think that there has been in the past, at least, sort of this narrative that folks in the community may hold, on the whole, may hold attitudes of like varying and sort of quote unquote resistance to adoption of evidence-based interventions, um, and the like. And so we were really, curious what that would look like in this sort of scale up phase where, essentially reimbursement was being tied to delivery of evidence-based interventions a way that it hadn't before in the county. And we just learned, you know, so much about that sort of disabused that kind of sentiment. And for the most part, our, folks talked really just about wanting any kind of tool that would help their children and families. And it was interesting when we asked them explicitly about adaptation. And many of these folks were, were ethnic minority therapists themselves. And had proximity to the communities they served in many ways. And when we asked them about cultural adaptation, we were surprised how in the interviews they were sort of, that was a very limited set. That was sort of the minority of the time they were saying that we were adapting for these reasons. But really, kind of when you got on the ground and you observed what they were doing, and not just in their descriptions of what they're doing, but actually in their observations, it was very clear that they were bringing so much of their own lived experience and, ability to really translate concepts, not just language translate, but culturally translate concepts, and, really do that work of like earning trust and being collaborative in ways that, they weren't even thinking about as necessarily cultural adaptation. But when, Stephanie Yu has gone in and done some direct observation of sessions where therapists said they were or were not adapting TFCBT in session, and you could see that they were bringing so much of themselves and their, their local expertise to how they delivered TFCBT. And when we started defining it operationally in terms of like, was this something, laid out in the manual or not? They were just bringing such richness. So all of this just to say that, there's so much wisdom and competence, and, that's very observable, and maybe not even, I don't even think we necessarily have the frameworks to do justice to the contributions of sort of that provider level input. And then I'll also just say that I think we're focusing so much on provider level factors today, whereas we know sort of the outer context is huge. Certainly Maggie's sort of alluding to that. But certainly on the massive scope of things, that's going to be just such a huge driver in the coming time that we, hopefully we can, have opportunities to really understand what are some implementation strategies that people can manage around, where there's this, and Anna alluded to it too, this sort of outer context that may become hostile to equity focused efforts, racially focused, and especially gender expansive, gender affirming care. Certainly there's this huge outer setting thing that's going to happen that we're on the cusp of. So I'm looking forward to another maybe outer context focus DNI session that seems like we're really going to need to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's a great way to end. Oh, Anna, did you want to add one thing?
I just want to add a clear example to me about strategies in that context. And Maggie mentions the strategy being one of the pieces to adapt. I'm going to put his name because his name is really Ruben Parra Cardona. So Ruben is a trained social worker, family physician, family therapist who works a lot with families, Latinx families and communities. And fast forward, after many ICE raids, which will happen a lot more, again, a lot of his trials now, he actually, so in terms of the outer context and how can we support the families, right? So he has done RCT, adapting the intervention, and that's a whole nother conversation. But what he does now is that he brings lawyers at the first session, and every family has a deportation plan. He also changes the setting. So he has, I think, finished a trial in a basement of a church as a sanctuary, right? So we can do the work, and we should do the work, and we need to do the work now more than ever. I think what I'm bringing up specifically is that as we think about the strategies and as we think about the outer context, that we need to be creative and think about us as a village to support the communities that will need us in the forthcoming years.
Yeah, that's really inspiring work. Thank you for sharing that last piece. I don't see any questions in the chat, and it looks like we're sort of running toward the end. So it sounds like we all are just appreciating our wonderful panelists. So thank you again to Drs. Lau, Baumann, and Price for your wonderful presentations and for participating in this series.